If it isn't clear from my entire existence, I love the Souls games, and Elden Ring is no exception to that fact. It's the most ambitious, massive, gargantuan undertaking From Software have ever attempted, and firmly asserts itself as just one more step on their slow and steady climb to world domination. If there's one thing that sets Elden Ring apart from the other games in From's lineup, it's scale. And the bonkers world size, staggering amount of NPC quests to mess up, and length of the journey you go on really does feel like you're on an epic quest through Wales. The sheer overwhelming enormity of it all is at once the game's greatest strength and its greatest flaw. Before I get into any kind of opinions on this game, I've got to say that I'm comparing it against other Souls games in a vacuum, because they all stand so far above their contemporaries in every single way that for me, they're in a category of their own. I've been playing Elden Ring every day for 2 months and I've loved almost every single moment of it. And also I will be spoiling endgame bosses and story events for all the Souls games indiscriminately during this video. I didn't realize it at first, but I feel like the vast proportions of Elden Ring benefit it more in presentation than anywhere else. Take Anor Londo for example. The first time we see it, it looks awesome, and all the little buildings like tiny dots below give the palace a great sense of scale. But that entire level is really just 3 buildings and an elevator. Even though it's been completely abandoned for hundreds if not thousands of years, and only has Gwendolyn left to keep the place normalish with his puppet show, it feels like he should have spent less time doing his sister's chest, and more time actually keeping the place defended. Even with Ornstein and Smuff, it doesn't exactly feel like the golden city of the gods. Leyndell, the equivalent in Elden Ring, feels much more believable due to the sheer size of the bastard. There are a shitload of knights kicking about outside the first massive wall, with battlements and trebuchets and dual tree sentinels. Then inside the second completely unbreached wall is an explorable city full of enemies, where you really get a sense that you're fighting the remnants of a proper military operation in their home city after a huge war. All of Elden Ring has this kind of design, and I thought it was such a great detail to see that the major locations on the map were actually well defended at key locations to stop the Tarnished from coming to gank everyone's great runes. The size of the castles and areas aren't to scale with what they would be in real life, because no one in their right mind wants to spend 2 actual weeks riding across Caelid. But their scale mixed with the freedom we have to explore them stands in stark contrast to the village-sized cities with their linear hallways in previous titles, where in other FromSoft games I feel like I'm walking down a road towards a specific objective. The whole time I was playing Elden Ring, I felt I was on an epic sprawling quest to reunite the Great Runes from the 4 corners of the lands between, and that feeling of adventure was almost solely on the back of the huge world I was traversing. It seems almost too obvious to say it, with the ridiculous amount of parallels and straight up references littered through the game, but I couldn't help but be reminded of The Lord of the Rings while I was playing. The original fantasy epic of a little hobbit crossing the entire world to destroy a ring was perfectly mirrored in my quest to cross the entire world to put a ring back together. If I haven't made it clear already, the game is fucking massive, much bigger than I ever expected it to be. After like 10 or 20 hours in, once I'd explored most of Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, and I started Stormvale Castle, I had convinced myself that the opening area must be the open world bit, and then the rest of the game would be a long linear stretch similar to the other Souls games. I mean, how much bigger could the world be than Limgrave? Then I stepped out into Liurnia after beating Godric, and was completely awestruck at the sheer amount of distance between myself and all the far off areas I knew I'd have to explore at some point. Every single time I unlocked a new bit of the map, I laughed as it doubled in size, and every single time I thought that would be the end of it. The open world is by no means an empty husk either, and much like Breath of the Wild or Metro Exodus, it's filled with shit to do. So much shit that it took me 170 hours just to beat the game, and I wasn't stopping to smell the roses either. I was running from cave to hero's grave like a headless chicken that doesn't realize it's about to get run over by an ancient combine harvester. There is at least 3 times the amount of shit to do in this game as there has been in any Souls game previously, and we all know that quantity is the most important measure of whether something is good or not, so that must make it 3 times better, mustn't it? The problem that Elden Ring has made for itself with its size is that by magnifying the Souls formula to such an insane degree, it has just spread the quality of a Souls game out across a wider area. I love the Souls combat loop, and much like my feelings about Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons, Elden Ring's huge scale is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it's a seemingly endless amount of areas, caves, bosses, weapons, and armor to explore and collect, which is all fresh and unique that can keep a player entertained for months without showing them the same thing twice. And on the other hand, it's a seemingly endless amount of side shit to do, which is a lot of fun, but doesn't really have the sustained level of quality of the main core game. Instead of being a 30-hour game with 25 hours of amazing gameplay and 5 hours of decent to bullshit stuff, Elden Ring is a 150-hour game with 75 hours of amazing gameplay and 75 hours of decent gameplay. All of the unique weapons and abilities that are usually hidden just off the main path in other Souls games are instead scattered around the entire map as rewards in caves and dungeons. And don't get me wrong, this is an excellent incentive to explore, but the inherent nature of build variety and the RPG elements of the game mean that other than gaining souls, exploration can often be a fruitless endeavour. When you explore the 5th cave in a row to find yet another weapon or spell that is completely useless to your build, it feels like you're exploring pointlessly. Conversely, there are items that are essential to your build that are hidden in places that you might never visit, and severely hinder yourself in the process because of it. The outcome from all of this is more often than not a playstyle focused not on exploring the world, but on scouring the wikis for the locations of the best items and weapons that fit your playstyle, and heading directly to those areas whilst ignoring everything else. I ran an R1 spamming endure based cold and bleed light roll hook claws build, which focused on doing as much damage as possible before whatever was in front of me could kill me. It worked extremely well, especially in the early game, but I was very close to completely missing the winged sword insignia, which was a cornerstone of my playstyle for 90% of the game. I was rewarded for exploring and finding it, of course, but the exploration feels more like you're rolling a chance on whether the reward is going to be useful or not, and the only way to guarantee you find the best items for your build is to either systematically go through every cave you can find like I did, or just look it up online. I feel like Elden Ring's exploration is the polar opposite of Breath of the Wild's. Both games do a great job encouraging you to explore, but where Breath of the Wild has useful but also extremely generic items and upgrades in every direction, and so you can explore anywhere you want as much or as little as you wish and reach the same endpoint, Elden Ring has a much more all or nothing approach, where there is one specific place you need to get the item or weapon that will complete your build, and you might not find it for 100 hours or at all. But the uniqueness of these rewards makes every cave and area legitimately worth exploring fully, even once you've completed all the others. The NPC questlines are one of the most bittersweet parts of the game's open world. There are twice as many NPCs in this game than the others combined, and every single one is twice as fucking impossible to complete. It is very difficult to complete NPC quests in every Souls game, but Elden Ring has to take the cake for NPCs just teleporting to a different part of the map for no reason, with no explanation of where they've went. I was extremely thorough and very lucky, and I, through some miraculous guidance of grace, managed to get almost all of them done without looking anything up. But there were certain times when it was just impossible. Like, what the fuck is going on with Blythe and Ranni's quest? That shit is insane. How the fuck was I supposed to know that I needed to talk to the doll 4 times in a row at a specific site of grace that I discovered before I even found the stupid doll? All the quest lines are a mess of constantly visiting every single NPC just in case they're connected in some way, reloading the game just to see if anything has changed, and exploring the entire world to find the one item that is required to proceed, which may or may not be locked behind a bugged, broken invasion. I absolutely love the NPCs in this game, and Millicent, Blythe, and Bok are all characters I'll remember forever. But the transfer of the NPC quest formula to open world seems to have just promoted the use of following a guide, and I think the fact that the most difficult to obtain ending is also by far the most common supports that idea. There are a lot of new things included in Elden Ring that are astoundingly good, yet even though they seem to be birthed from the epic scale and exploration of the open world, they also seem like a logical progression of the Souls formula. Being able to change Ashes of War and regular weapons is an absolute godsend, and even though it seems the most powerful ones are still locked to individual weapons, I felt extremely empowered when I had the idea to put Endure on my hook claws, so I could essentially ignore the entire point of combat and stunlock enemies to death. It allows for a huge amount of build diversity for people willing to experiment, and means that as long as you meet the requirements to wield a weapon, you can find a way to get decent damage out of it. Spirit Ashes allow people that are struggling with particular encounter to make it easier without having to roll the dice on summoning a real person that will completely steamroll the boss and take all the fun out of the experience. They are still extremely overpowered and low risk, high reward strategies, but also somehow much less overpowered than just using normal weapons. Even though Bloodborne's gothic horror is much more my style, Elden Ring has without a doubt the most beautiful game world I've ever had the pleasure of immersing myself in. The diverse range of areas, each with its own special feel, and the magnificent Erd tree towering above it all. Adding to this is the day and night cycle, which allows you to see each area in a whole new light, sometimes even spawning new enemies. I recently went back to the Halig tree just to look around, and by chance it was sunset when I got there, and I just stood for a few minutes in awe at just how beautiful this game is. I could even just sit and watch and listen to the nomadic merchants play their violin, where the hauntingly beautiful sound perfectly matches the animation of their fingers. From are usually fucking awesome at directing their games, and their earlier titles for me personally stand at the very top when it comes to set pieces, but they've somehow just went above and beyond and completely nailed all of them in Elden Ring. Turning up at an emptied Redmane castle to be greeted with the Halo theme, Morgoth's jump scare invasion, or the Saturday morning jazzercise group, they all feel like unique and perfectly scripted experiences, and even though you're absolutely supposed to find them, the open world setting always feels like you've just stumbled into them out of nowhere. Every time you enter a new area, it feels like a treat for the senses, and each one leaves its own memorable and lasting impression. This game is a perfect demonstration of From Software's complete mastery over boss cutscenes. The slow, brooding tempo of each one serves as a way to build tension before the encounter, and also neatly cut through it during the second phase, providing contrast to the action whilst also throwing the player off their rhythm completely. The weird camera angles and extreme close-ups make the most of their extremely limited control over the camera through the game, and each one is bursting with character and feels like a genuine cinematic event and a rare treat for the player. Unfortunately, the boss fights themselves are one of the weakest aspects of the game, and one of the biggest downfalls of the open world design. All of those areas need bosses to gatekeep their rewards, and there is no way there could ever be over 100 unique interesting bosses with cool backstories in the game. And so, much like the Chalice dungeons, many bosses are repeats and boss versions of regular enemies. But unfortunately, unlike the Chalice dungeons, they are presented as the core game with unique and important rewards and not optional side content to be explored whenever. These bosses could be excusable for the most part, but even the main bosses have some major flaws. There are exceptions like Margaret and Godric, but it pains me to say that most of the boss design in this game seems to be centered around making them as broken and bullshit as possible. The regular bosses are the worst offenders, and the game will often throw things like 2 gargoyles, 2 crucible knights, or 3 fucking dumbass rock fucking crystal fucks in a tiny room at you for seemingly no reason. I felt forced to use my mimic tier to just make these fights bearable, because they are in no way fun. There is no difficult moveset to learn because they can just stunlock you to death and break the game in the same way you summoning can. It genuinely feels like a lot of the encounters have been designed with Spirit Ashes in mind to be the core experience, rather than designed for single player with Spirit Ashes being there to help those in need. The main bosses are better, but not by much. It seems like every single one of the endgame bosses is given a move or a second phase that is intentionally designed to be boring and impossible to beat alone. I had a hard time beating Moog underground, but by the end I'd memorized his moveset and I thought he was a really fun boss. Then in his real fight, they just decide to let him spray bleed buildup all over the room for no fucking reason and give him an attack that you need a specific crystal tier to counter. And it feels so unpredictable and luck based that it just makes the fight boring. Moog is the only main boss I use my mimic tier on, but more often than not, the other bosses felt more like a slog and less like fun. Soloing Melania is probably my proudest achievement in all of gaming. I spent 4 days stuck on her and then celebrated non-stop for 20 minutes. She's a fucking awesome boss in lore and design, and from the moment I walked in there and died immediately, I understood that she really was undefeated. She has a fucking awesome moveset which is hard as nails but rewarding to beat. She's extremely painful to fight, but every death against her feels earned, and that would be perfect. Except she also has her waterfowl dance move, which is essentially her saying your free trial of life is over until you get so pissed off by it that you look up online how to dodge it and go and get Bloodhound Step from the Black Rider in Caelid. I don't know if I've just got better at playing these games, but Melania was the only boss in the game that gave me the true Souls experience of a hard boss with a moveset you actually have to perfect to win, and not just a moveset filled with AoE splash damage and status effects that is a chore to fight against. It really feels like they made a shitload of awesome bosses, realized they're too easy with Spirit Ashes, and then give each one a load of bullshit AoE magic attacks that are designed to brutally punish heals and are almost undodgeable to balance things out. I love this game, but if Ishin is the absolute pinnacle of Souls bosses, the Elden Beast is the most catastrophic letdown of a final boss I've ever encountered. Instead of testing all your skills and knowledge you've learned thus far, which Radigan and Godfrey do a pretty good job of, the Elden Beast constantly runs away, ruins your lock-on, and spams magic at you. The only difficulty in the fight at all comes from it following one of the hardest bosses in the game, and even though its visual design is a cool nod to Princess Mononoke, it makes the game's final triumphant moment feel like it ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. All of that said, the visual design and lore of the main bosses still makes them memorable and worthy of praise. Rather than fighting the remnants of the main players of a story well after everything has gone to shit like we do in most Souls games, we fight most of the important characters while they're still active in the community. Most of them haven't even gone insane yet. Also, they're all related. Elden Ring, at its core, is a family drama, and even though I'm still piecing things together, it feels excellent to try and work out the motivations behind each character, the factions that form between them, and how each of them strive individually to achieve their own goals and win this game of Elden Thrones. It's got such a strong identity as a fantasy setting and draws clear influences from worldwide mythology, whilst maintaining its own individuality. The Souls games always feel like they have amazing consistency through their world building, which allows people to craft elegant and legitimate lore theories around what little information we have, but the grand scale of Elden Ring makes it feel like it can wear a little more of its world building on its sleeve, while still leaving the details shrouded in mystery. I know I've been tough on this game, but I have to be honest with myself. Elden Ring is still a brilliant game, and in being the biggest and most ambitious Souls game by a long way, it feels the closest in atmosphere through its exploration and gameplay to the epic fantasy proportions of its narrative. The downside is that this massive sense of scale comes at the price of the quality of gameplay being spread much more thinly across the map. Although more Souls is by no means a bad thing, and I got as much unique enjoyment out of one playthrough of this single game as I would out of the 3 or 4 linear titles combined. There are so many special moments and characters that will stay in my heart, and I'll never forget how long I spent wondering who the Two Fingers were, and whether they were one person or a group of people. just to be finally greeted by the most literal interpretation of the name, or putting on 10 different items in an intelligence crystal tier just to use law of regression on a statue and be greeted with the most insane late game twist I could have ever dreamed of, or the feeling of getting my ass kicked by Melania for hundreds of attempts for over 10 hours, just to finally come out on top in the end. This is truly one of the most special games I've ever experienced. Thank you to From Software for stepping out of your comfort zone and constantly daring to innovate. Thank you to Melania for reminding me you're the blade of Mikola. And thank you for watching. Peace.